All right. This is Taylor Larson from Arizona Research Lodge number 1 in Chandler, Arizona. I'm currently the Worshipful Master, and then we're going to be giving a presentation on the lessons of Leon for Mr. M.R. Osborne. All right, brother, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good evening. I'm Michael Osborne. I'm speaking to you from Northampton in England, and I've been invited by the Arizona Lodge of Research number 1 to do to present a paper on the lessons of Leon.
Perfect. Thank you very much, brother. You can go ahead and start.
Well, thank you very much to the Arizona Lodge of Research number 1. That's very much appreciated. Brethren, before I begin my paper, if you'll permit me, I'd like to say a few words in honour of the memory of Her late Majesty the Queen. I haven't really had an opportunity to do so on a personal level in a public way hitherto. You'll appreciate it's been a difficult week here because of that. We often speak in Freemasonry of charity, chivalry, and exemplary moral conduct as if they were exclusive to our order, with no wider provenance. Yet chivalry and duty to God and society is also a core principle of monarchy. These are virtues which extend back long before King Solomon and the supreme task that he was given. Her Majesty the Queen was an example of a life dedicated to service, to God, and above all to the principles of personal chivalry, which speak only of selflessness and duty. In the passing of the Queen, many millions of people across her realms and Commonwealth feel a deep sense of loss, not least myself this past week, and I'm sure our grief is also felt by those in countries who do not share the Queen as their head of state, but who recognise that in her there was someone who stood out as being one of the very finest of the kingly anointed servants sent amongst us. So turning to my paper on the lessons of Leon, my focus this afternoon will be based on 3 themes drawn from the lessons. First, the general doctrine of Martinez de Pasquale. Second, San Martin's use of the rainbow in nature as a metaphor of creation. And third, a discussion of whether Pasquale's system was Gnostic. I anticipate my presentation will last around about 50 minutes or thereabouts, and will then be followed by a discussion. As a general observation before we engage with the issues, the importance of finding experienced guides in life cannot be emphasized enough. The 18th century writings of the Elu Cohen adepts provide us not only with a glimpse into an advanced path along the higher spiritual progress we desire in Freemasonry, but they open nothing less than a portal for us to enter into that path. These men did not only stop and say what they were about, they told us quite plainly what their goals were and how to set about achieving them. It is true that for beginners on the Rosicrucian path, and for those outside of the esoteric tradition in Freemasonry alike, the lessons of Leon are difficult to understand. But with time, patience, and research, a deepening appreciation will open up, providing you with an entirely new way of looking at the world and our place in it. There are, of course, other Elu Cohen manuscripts, catechisms, and rites available to read, all of which are important in our personal studies, and which tell us much about this profound and fascinating 18th century order. But the lessons as a collection of writings mostly stand out because they contain the deeply personal thoughts of Pasquale's adepts, and not least those of 2 of the greatest Masonic thinkers of the time, Louis-Claude de Saint Martin and Jean-Baptiste Villemeuse. Reading the lessons connects us with the desire to authentically engage with those brilliant minds. How so, you may ask? Because the lessons are not only a contemplation of Pasquale's teachings, but they show us the practical steps to be taken. Because of this, The lessons of Leon are, in truth, the study materials of the heart as much as they are of our intellect. Above all else, we are reminded of the deeply Christian sentiments and beliefs underpinning them. My sincere thanks, therefore, to worshipful brother Larson and everyone else in the Arizona Lodge of Research number 1 for inviting me to speak. I am, of course, delighted to share my very personal insights and for this opportunity to promote knowledge of the lessons to a much wider audience. My translation of the transcripts that we know as the Lessons of Leon, or A Course of Martinism from the 18th century, was the culmination of a personal spiritual journey emerging from my own path. Indeed, I say culmination, but in truth it was merely the beginning of a new chapter in my own spiritual growth. That, however, is unavoidable, since the secret tradition of following, and which is involved in taking on this very lonely path, it incorporates suffering and a sense of loneliness, but without which it cannot be said that we ever truly depart the dark night of the soul. So it was, after being let down by a couple of close connections who had expressed a desire to publish the lessons, that I decided to go it alone, and I brought out my own paperback in the early part of 2021, shown here on the left of your screens, and here on the screen. It was a small paperback. On its cover is an image of what is believed to be Martinez de Pasquale, taken from the Carte philosophique et mathématique. I withdrew the paperback from print later that year in order to improve the translation. Curiously, I recently noticed some chancers on Amazon trying to sell a copy for over $1,300. Now, that's preposterous, but I think it does go to show how seriously some people can take first editions. That said, the second edition, brought out in hardback, and as shown here, hopefully you can see that, it's on the right hand of the screen, contains a much improved translation, and it's been released through Rose Circle Publications by the veritable Piers Vaughan. It's available on Amazon, online, Barnes & Noble and Waterstones for about $35. So a few brief words then on the sources for the documents that we refer to as the Lessons of Leon. The contributors were Saint-Martin, Villemuse and Dauterive, whose handwritten manuscripts, and in particular the notebook of Saint-Martin, are located at the Municipal Library at Lyon. Dauterive was a minority contributor, and he falls silent on or after around about 1775. Martinez de Pasquale died in January 1774, just as the Lessons of Leon were first being written. Pasquale was the influential figure behind the learning and practice of the Elohim, and we will look at his doctrines in more detail shortly. He is said, however, to have never personally visited the Elohim temple at Lyon, but he did write to them regularly. It was from Pasquale's later admirers, towards the close of the 19th century, that many of the original Elohim papers have come down to us today. These men included Henri Delargue and Papus, whose collections eventually ended up in the municipal library and in various other private collections and libraries, particularly in France, which over time have entered the public domain one way or another. No doubt there are many that haven't, and others yet to be discovered. And then we have Robert Amadou, who researched an extensive amount of these transcripts, which he published in 1999 for the first time. His is a seminal work and provides a detailed and well-researched background into the provenance and sources of the lessons. So in this slide, we move on to the structure of the Lessons of Leon. This is an image of the contents page where you can see the book is structured into 4 main parts. Parts 1 through 3 contain the writings, catechisms and notes made during or following the weekly meetings of the Elu Cohen at Villemouse's house in Lyon, and which took place throughout the entirety of 1774, 75 and 76. They fall silent after that year. Following Amadou, the English version also categorizes these into those respective years, as you can see. However, part 4 is divided into 2 further parts. The first contains the undated and generally more detailed commentaries made by Villemouse and Saint-Martin, and the final part contains transcripts of the letters written by Martinez de Pasquale between 1766 and 1773. Many of the entries speak of the challenges faced by the Elu Cohen adepts as they worked their way through the teachings and practical workings given to them by their master. The obvious question arises as to what value these manuscripts have for the passing man of desire today. The answer is that Pasquale's doctrine was not new. It claimed it to be a revival of man's original religion. The writings show us how our inner journey should match our outer lives on the path towards what Pasquale termed reintegration. Pasquale himself was influenced by this gentleman, Emanuel Swedenborg, who, like him, experienced dreams and visions of spiritual realms and the multiplicity of beings that inhabit them. The themes in the lessons inevitably include elements of Swedenborg's spiritualism, as well as strong alchemical and Rosicrucian principles. According to Swedenborg's book, The Heavenly Doctrine, Christ appeared to open his spiritual eyes so that from then on, Swedenborg could freely visit heaven and hell to converse with angels, demons and other spirits. Pasquale himself claimed to have received direct communication from a lofty spiritual entity identified as Le Chose, the Thing. This, he taught his pupils, could be achieved by them by following the very exact magical operations that he gave to them. The image here is of the first couple of pages of my introduction to the lessons. I'll give you a flavour of the detail contained in the book. In the introduction, I discuss Pasquale's general doctrine in particular and its impact on the thinking and practices of the Elu Cohen adepts, so as to give you a flavour, really, of the material that follows. This is a slide of the lessons from 1774. It gives you an idea of the length of them, and they're all dated, and generally who wrote them is stated. Some of them are unknown, most of them aren't. They're much shorter than the lessons that come later. By way of example, if we skip a couple of parts and head to 1776, you've got here an example of a page from the book. You'll see 2 lessons presented to you, the second of which is much longer. Now, this is already a couple of years after Pasquale's death, so they're becoming more explicatory and more descriptive. The meetings of the Elu Cohen are less regular at this point in Lyon, and you can feel Villemouse and Saint-Martin trying to preserve the memory of their master's teachings in these later lessons. Now, in the example shown here, Saint-Martin discusses the initiation of an Elu Cohen into the order and gives us a correspondence between that and the present condition of man and the goal of reintegration. To quote from the penultimate paragraph, Saint-Martin states that man's third and perfect deliverance will be at the end of the universal cycle, at the end of time, to be reintegrated in the divine centre. So there are some very profound and some very deep metaphysical concepts contained in these pages. An example here from part 4. The undated notes and longer descriptive notes of Villemot's, for the most part, and Saint Martin as well, are contained in part 4 of the book, just before we move on to the letters of Martinez de Pasquale. Now, Pasquale's letters are here, and the one on the right, dated, I chose this because it's the closest to the date that we have. He's writing at the time of the equinox, and in 1768. And it's typical because it contains an example of his workings and directions to his adepts, bearing in mind that he never visited there. It was very important for him to be very precise in the instructions that he gave them. And the letters really are quite simply fascinating, and should be read. There's a deep resonance in his letters of the Christianized theurgy that he devised. You probably know that he took upon a couple of grimoires, the Keys of Solomon, the Magic of Abramelin, and he Christianized them. And Pasquale's deep Christianity is mirrored in these letters because he urges his adepts and sometimes instructs them to follow a Catholic prayer cycle as well, and particularly in the practical directions he gives. So it's clear to see that all of this arises from the deep wellspring that we recognise in Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism, forgive me. So turning then quickly to the cosmogony of Martinez de Pasquale. Having looked at the core framework of the book, I'll now provide a brief overview of the practical, spiritual and doctrinal system devised by Martinez de Pasquale, since this can't be divorced from the writings of his adepts in the Lessons of Lyons. It's essential to have this grounding first. Now, Pasquale's father was a high-grade Freemason, and it's clear that his son was influenced by him. Pasquale was also influenced by the Kabbalah and Rosicrucianism. However, Swedenborg was arguably the greatest influence on Pasquale's system, and this connection is often underplayed by researchers. So, for example, Swedenborg taught that the scriptures hold a deeper allegorical meaning. He believed that the goal of all spiritual work is to overcome the ingrained selfish tendencies in man. He regarded the perfection of this work as an ever closer union with God. Swedenborg described this as the spiritual evolution of the human spirit as it progresses through the 7 heavens emanating from God. He reported that the spiritual world was more real than our world. He taught that man has an eternal spiritual body that continues to live after death. Swedenborg described the spiritual world as being very close to us, and that it can be seen through personal mystical experience, and that the difference, the distance between us and the spirit is very thin, to use an old word. Pasquale drew on Swedenborg's principles to develop his own particular philosophy based on the reintegration of man back to his original virtues and powers as he describes them. Now, there were 2 aspects of Pasquale's system: the doctrinal, that's the general doctrine, his metaphysical system, and the theurgical, magical or particular doctrine. His Christianized theurgy took Swedenborg's philosophy a step further, as it offered a practical path to reintegration through the operation of magic to effect interaction with supernatural agencies in human affairs, which was something that Swedenborg did not encourage in his followers. The purpose of Pasquale's white magic was a means of binding the evil spirits that form a barrier or envelope around man's intellect, our thoughts, and which would then enable the operator to receive the good influences and guidance from the saints and angels. It would also, most importantly, open up a path whereby Christ's sacrifice and Christ's spirit could begin to spiritually purge the individual person from their sin. Pasquale's metaphysical doctrine is contained in his unfinished treatise on the reintegration of beings into their original estate, virtues and powers, both spiritual and divine, and pictorially in his universal table, which is shown here. In it, Pasquale describes a state where, before the universe existed, God emanated from within himself a class of primary spiritual beings, some of whom had the potential for evil latent within them. The lessons make plenteous reference to the universal table, and it's a key document to have with regard to understanding them. My advice when you read the lessons of Lyons is to print out a copy of the universal table on a piece of paper. I've deliberately not put it in the book because it's often very difficult and somewhat frustrating to backwards and forwards sometimes when there's so many references to it. So my suggestion is have a copy and use that then when you're reading a particular lesson or letter. Okay. So let us therefore take a look at this universal table in more detail. The Creator formed the primary spiritual beings within his immensity for the manifestation of his power, justice, and glory. However, these primary spirits wanted to create life of their own, to be worshipped themselves, and to become as gods. They harbored pride. Once expelled from the divine immensity, essentially they were expelled so that God could contain them and prevent them from, or prevent their multiplication from affecting the divine immensity. He cast them out and then created 3 realms to protect and guard the divine immensity and its laws. So we have then the major, the inferior, and minor spirits. In the circle of the minor spirits, God brought into being a super angel, or essentially what we may refer to as a super angel. It's a collectivity of unlimited human intelligences, the primitive Adam, who enjoyed the thought, image, and nature of God, and who was given power over creation. In this sense, the lessons often refer to the quaternary or fourfold nature of man, because man not only had his own power of thought, will, and action, but he also had access to God's thoughts, whose duty it was his to fulfill. The lessons tell us that man must return to the cross placed at the 6 circumferences of the divine thoughts in order to command, direct, preserve, and defend universal creation from these fallen spirits, represented here by the black arrow. Now, Adam set about forming the original earth with the forces contained within the axis of spiritual fire, the prima materia by which the created universe was formed, with the help of the 7 great planetary spirits or luminaries created to assist him. So we have them here: Saturn, Mercury, or the Sun, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Venus, and the Moon. This terrestrial Earth, which is represented by a triangle at the bottom of the universal table, vibrated at a much higher frequency and hence didn't decay, albeit that time was brought into existence as a force to contain the fallen spirits and to set a limit for their reconciliation. The chief of the fallen beings, Lucifer, instilled in Adam a desire to be a god. Adam, unable to exist in the presence of the divine immensity, because of his proud thoughts, shattered and fell into the grosser physical realm, represented here. Materialized Earth was subjected to the ravages of time, decay, and death because it was no longer maintained by Adam. Humanity still has the same work to fulfill and must reintegrate itself as the super angel once again, but which can only be done around the octonary spiritual being who is both fully divine and fully man, known to us as Christ, in the Martinist tradition as the repairer. This process cannot be completed on this present earth, and Adam must pass through each of the 7 heavens or luminaries in which the influence of evil on him, on his intellect, becomes less and less strong. And there we have the serpent path of return back to Eden. Now, a more simplified expression of this great metaphysical tableau, or at least its principal imagery, is contained within our own first-degree tracing board, as you can clearly see. Freemasonry is the organisation as well from which Pasquale exclusively recruited, as he believed that the philosopher's stone had already been imparted to its initiates. So to summarise the preceding slide, what I've just described is referred to as Pasquale's general doctrine. It's his metaphysical plan of the universe. Essentially, that the first emanated beings were conceived before time existed and developed thoughts of hubris and evil and were cast from heaven in order to be contained. Adam was created as a thinking, pure spirit, destined to command the whole of creation and to reconcile them to God. He was tempted through the insinuations of their evil thoughts, and his pride led him to sin against God. Interestingly, the lesson describes Adam as taking on a body of dark matter, which is a very curious expression. So, Adam, therefore, began life in Pasquale's system as the great architect of the universe, and to quote Willemoes in 1774, man was a thinking, pure spirit, destined to command the whole of creation. This spirit occupied the centre, from where it was able to transport itself to all the spaces of creation. Man can no longer traverse creation in thought, but this inability now makes us feel that we are at present deprived, and that we formerly had a very different nature. The material body in which we are now enveloped is quite contrary to our primary nature. Therefore, the spirit within us is always trying to get out and ardently desires to see this link with the physical body broken. Adam repented, of course, but it remained necessary for his form, locked in gross elemental matter, to be purged of all its impurity. This path is the path of reintegration, and it begins with man needing to shield his mind from the evil intellects about him. So as to form a junction with Christ's spirit, man must first create the right conditions to screen his intellect from the evil influences affecting it. Which brings us on to Martinez de Pasquale's particular doctrine. So called, the particular doctrine contains the magical rituals detailing how reintegration is to commence here on Earth. This was to be done by reinstituting with exactitude the cult and rituals of Adam's third son, Seth, from whom the rituals of the Jerusalem temple were descended. This cult requires to be reinstituted because man must now connect himself with the purifying astral force of Christ's sacrifice, his blood, which purges the corruption of sin and therefore repairs us. It is said that Pasquale was able to demonstrate invocations of supernal beings, as well as the departed souls of earlier, fully reconciled human adepts. These guides would create the right conditions for man's junction with the repairer to take effect. This is not a denial of the exoteric doctrine of justification by faith, by the way, but it is one that demands good works in order for it to be perfected. Pasquale was not, therefore, at variance with orthodox doctrine, but he did emphasize the necessity of magical process for the connection to be established. He would emphasize to his followers, for instance, that going to Mass and was participating essentially in a theurgical operation, which we know to be the case. And indeed, in the Lessons of Lyons, we read of Saint Martin recommending attending at least 2 communions a year in order to connect with a particular junction of the divinity meeting physical matter. Now, much of Pasquale's personal correspondence to the Elu Cohen is concerned with detailed guidance on how to prepare for such invocations. An added dimension is the chivalrous system, which provided them with the discipline and moral values they required for that task. Another reason, perhaps, for his preference in recruiting army officers and masons of quality to the order. Pasquale established an order of exorcists, therefore, drawn from high-grade Freemasonry, but they were much more than that. The objective was to eventually create a protective envelope or barrier around humanity so as to shield it from the influence of evil on the collective human mind, and which great work would speed up the second coming of Christ and the final reconciliation. An indication of the depth of feeling of the Lyon adepts in this regard can be sensed through the words of Saint Martin, who in August 1775 had this to say: "There is always contraction as a result of reaction by the godless to destroy the good we have received. So when it feels a little warm, you have to be careful not to slow down, but on the contrary, redouble your efforts. This is when I often sin." So he's talking there, of course, of pride getting in the way of these magical operations where he's making a connection with the spiritual realm. Let us now pull together some of Pasquale's ideas by looking at detail at one of Saint Martin's manuscripts in the Lessons of Lyons, which is based on the theme of the metaphysical significance of the rainbow. These notes eventually formed the basis of Saint Martin's more detailed treatise on the spiritual and temporal relationships of the rainbow, which is available to read in the public domain if you wish to do so. I certainly recommend it. The natural rainbow is an arch of colours caused by the refraction and dispersion of the sun's light by rain in the atmosphere. In Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 28, we read, "As the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice speaking." It also recalls the flood narrative in Genesis, where a bow appears after the great flood, indicating to Noah that God would never destroy life again. The Noahide covenant, as recounted in Genesis chapter 9, was further developed in the Talmud, and it includes 7 laws, the Sheva Mitzvot. 1, not to deny God. 2, not to blaspheme. 3, not to murder. 4, not to engage in sexual immorality. 5, not to steal. 6, not to be cruel to animals, specifically not to eat them while they're alive. And 7, to be just, or to create law. Pasquale characteristically took a purely allegorical view of the deluge, and he said that it alludes to the legend of the flood as a representation of man's fall into material matter, and that Noah is a type or metaphor of the Creator, floating on the waters and preserving in the ark the germ of all animal reproduction. The dimensions of the ark also correspond with the universal creation. According to the lessons of Lyons, the blessing God originally gave to the three children of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, represent man's triangular form, but also his quaternary nature, since Noah is also included, and of course represents the divinity. In 1774, Villemous wrote, "From Noah there were three nations, those of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham represents man's groin and was relegated to the south. He represents the type of Cain and the first prevaricating spirits. Shem, the posterity of the Israelites by Abraham, made a type of being like Seth. Japheth was the father of the third nation, that of the Gentiles." According to the lessons of Lyons, Noah, Ham, Japheth, and Shem are therefore types. Ham, Japheth, and Shem are the mind, body, and spirit of man, and Noah his innate divinity in the centre. We can see, therefore, how it is the mind of man, as represented by Ham, that is most vulnerable. These quaternary aspects are made perfect, of course, by Noah in the centre, as shown here, representing the divinity. These quaternary aspects, of course, are mirrored in Pasquale's universal table, as we've seen, in which the terrestrial realm is subdivided. In the centre is the lost word, representing the intimate relationship Adam once had as a being who was able to communicate directly with God. Man has lost this ability, but his task is to recover it. This entire image forms a symbol of a three-sided triangle with four values at the centre. So in effect, it's actually 7 in total. The number of the colours of the rainbow, and the 6 days of creation, and the day that God rested. It therefore acts as a cognizant reminder of the cross placed at the 6 circumferences of the creative divine thoughts, which symbolize man's authority to command, direct, preserve, and defend the universal creation and laws of God. According to the Mishnah, when the serpent tempter persuaded Adam to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it did so by reference to the first 7 words of the Hebrew Bible, thereby mocking the Creator. Each of these words is given a magical name and number. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we see how this sentence is structured numerologically on a 4 + 3 = 7 basis. Let me explain. It is symbolized on the 7 candlesticks of the temporal menorah, one of the 10 vessels of the tabernacle. It symbolized the 7 days of creation and the light of God. The first 3 words correspond to the first 3 lights and tell us what God did and when. The final 3 words tell us what he created. The fourth, shown here, is not in fact a word at all, but links the preceding 6 acts and is therefore immanent within them. This is the seventh light in the centre, which has no separate meaning on its own, but without which the entire sentence would convey absolutely no structure or meaning at all. The accusative is the case used to indicate the object of a verb and is sometimes referred to as the case of limitation. It limits the verb as to extent, direction, or goal of an action. This is important when we later discuss Gnosticism, because it is clear that God is setting limits on the powers of Adam, and God is in ultimate control of the creative process. There are therefore 6 words mirroring the 6 days of labour, and the 7 in the centre is that on which the Shekinah rested. Also of interest is that the Zohar states that the world was created by the 10 utterances or commandments of God. That's the Decalogue, the 10 commandments. And thus his law was always present, even at the very beginning of creation. We therefore see a numerical 1, 4, 7 structure in the creation myth, which is followed in Pasquale's universal table, I keep saying that, universal table, and finds correspondence in the natural pattern of the rainbow. So let us now turn to Saint Martin's notes on the rainbow as contained in the Lessons of Lyons, bringing with us some of the insights on Pasquale's cosmogony and the creation myth that we have now just gained. The following 2 slides contain the entire manuscript in full, but it's not very long, as you can see, so I propose that we read them together. The laws of divine wisdom and mercy are so disposed that all their productions bear the imprint of the archetype from which they emanate. And as there are several classes of these productions, each of them is, in some sort, the image and the copy of that which precedes it, and which is superior to it. Therefore, the physical and material world is an emblem of the spirit world, since the spirit world is the divine world. These 3 numbers, 1, 4, 7, which we recognize in the rainbow, express the 3 eternal powers of which the ternary results are universally manifested. Their addition renders 12 or 3 to show that these 3 powers serve the defense of the laws of the Creator and the punishment of his enemies. Elementary nature is a universal hieroglyph. Few objects strike the observer more than the rainbow. It is circular, it is septenary, and it separates darkness from light. We must seek to understand all that has been taught to us about the glorious function for which man had been responsible. The rainbow is septenary by the number of its colours, which are the effect of the rays of the sun, symbolizing its unity. Man, placed between the elemental sun and the rainbow, and having the faculty of moving the rainbow within himself, represents to us, by this active power, the number of the action of the quaternary unity. Indeed, if we join this active faculty in man with the 3 past faculties, which he has in common with the animals and all other material beings, the number 4 returns to him immediately. The 3 corporeal temporal beings in whose presence the clouds are dissipated symbolize the powerful numbers 1, 4, and 7, which are used to fight the enemies of the Creator expelled from the divine circle. The rainbow also reminds us of man's veritable spiritual situation since the prevarication of our common ancestor. He is as relative to the divinity and to the spirit of light as the dark clouds are relative to the corporeal sun and the rainbow that comes from it. Let us remark that, if it was obscured by the clouds, man could still walk to the point behind these 7 circles and take an intermediate place between the sun and the rainbow, which is only an emblem of the place man was intended to occupy spiritually. Let us remark, secondly, that man could not reach this intermediary point between the sun and the rainbow without having passed under the same circumferences, of which both use and sight were forbidden to him. He was therefore under the cloud. By this we have a sensible proof of the steps that man has the freedom to take to tend to his divine reintegration. Finally, let us see if the road through which man must pass to recover this temporal light is not the emblematic and material sign of the spiritual septenary being, whose invisible operations are the indispensable way granted for man's expiation and purification, as well as that of the 7 temporal regions he is obliged to traverse before arriving at his perfect reintegration into the abode of the righteous, before he can enjoy the divine light once more. we see that nature is in correspondence or universal hieroglyph of the spirit world. This echoes the terminology and teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg on correspondences. The divinity, man, and the spirit realms correspond with or around the rainbow, and the rainbow expresses the spiritual forces by which the universe was created. There is much for us to disseminate, but let us consider this by reference to the all-important key, which is the universal table shown here. Saint Martin is telling us that the sun behind the rainbow is an allegory of the divine monad, the number one. That man, the minor spirit, once knew God's thoughts, exercised his actions, and enjoyed command over the 6 days of the terrestrial and universal creation. That's the number 4. And the 7 colours of the rainbow correspond with the 7 heavens of the planetary spirits, which assisted man with creation. Man therefore once stood between the sun and the rainbow, or between the creator and the celestial immensity of the 7 worlds. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is what we're talking about here. In alchemical terms, the numbers 1, 4, and 7 also represent salt, sulfur, and mercury, of course, the symbolical elements through which all terrestrial creation was made. Man, however, now stands in front of the rainbow. See my mouse is down here. And can no longer directly perceive God. Yet he is reminded of the Creator's presence by it. And his original status is something that he's also made cognizant of by virtue of the image of the rainbow. As the clouds are relative to the corporeal sun, says Saint Martin, so the rainbow comes from it. Now, there is quite a lot of imagery to draw from the rainbow, it has to be said, and this is only a brief overview. The main point to take away for now is that the material universe corresponds with the spiritual realms. And as Saint Martin says, and I quote, "We must seek to understand from the rainbow all that has been taught to us about the glorious function for which man had once been responsible. It is circular, septenary, and separates darkness from light." So Saint Martin reminds us that man still has his first duty to fulfill, and that we must work our way back to the point behind the 7 luminaries in order to resume our intermediate space between them and God. However, he notes that man cannot reach this point between the first principle without first passing under the 7 circumferences, of which both use and sight are forbidden him. Man is now therefore under a cloud and confused. The rainbow, however, remains a sensible proof of the steps man must take for his reintegration. It is a reminder of it and a key to our return. He has to ascend through the serpent path beyond this world on his return to Eden. I now move to the final part of my paper. There is confusion concerning whether Martinez de Pasquale was Gnostic. Hopefully you can see that although there are similarities in the outward expression of his doctrines, that this was not in fact the case. What lies behind these claims is a misunderstanding of the esoteric nature of Pasquale's metaphysics, but which he himself claimed were merely the mystical expression of Catholic doctrine. Differing philosophies often appear alike, just as in nature we have the salamander and the lizard. Take, for example, the universal table shown here. It is to all intents and purposes identical to that of the universal table of the Gnostics. The image on the left is the universal table of the Simonians, potentially established, I suppose, by Simon Magus in the 1st century. Now, we can see there's an apparent correlation between the two. The divine immensity, the monad, the three spirits, the celestial immensity, and the terrestrial regions. Yet Pasquale's doctrines and those of Yelu Kuin were not Gnostic. I've already demonstrated how Pasquale's universal table mirrors the numerological 1, 4, 7, and 3 code contained within the Hebrew Bible, and as later elucidated in the Zohar. There is nothing Gnostic about this, since it reflects Jewish mysticism at its very core. One conclusion to draw is that perhaps the Gnostics somehow borrowed their universal chart from Judaism, but we may never know for sure. The differences may appear subtle to those unfamiliar with the principles of theology, but some of the reasons why Gnosticism differs from Pasquale's doctrine are quite profound. Firstly, in Pasquale's cosmogony, there is the complete absence of a demiurge. In Gnosticism, the demiurge or half-maker was already in rebellion against God when he created the lower regions. And he also forcibly incarnated spirit against its will into physical matter. In the Simonian system, for instance, this included wisdom herself, who was taken hostage by the demiurge and locked in matter. In contrast, Pasquale's system tells us that creation was begun by a good creator, and who, realizing the creatures of free will with evil intent had come about, expelled them from his divine immensity and conceived of a material universe in which to imprison them for the well-being of everyone else. God is the creator, and he planned the universal creation and emanated Adam to put his plans in place. The collective group soul of Adam, the minor spirit, to use Martin's terminology, was made in God's image, granted his powers, was capable of reading God's thoughts, and was given command over creation. But this was all good. Initially, Adam occupied a glorious form and existed in an incorruptible state of bliss in the circle of Eden. This account of the universal creation is not Gnostic. It is monotheistic and places God, the creator, at the center with man by his side. Indeed, Pasquale equates Adam and the great architect of the universe of Freemasonry, and this designation is in no way comparable with the evil demiurge of Gnosticism, who had created a bad world to imprison good. It is, in essence, an exact role reversal. Thus, while Adam was indeed the man-god of this world, it was God who freely bestowed his powers on Adam and created the conditions for him to go about his work. It was, if you will, devolution in its most noble form. The demiurge of the Gnostics, in contrast, stole the divinity's powers and acted against the will of the Father God, wherein lies the myth of Prometheus, but which Adam certainly was not. Another great disparity between Martinism and Gnosticism is the whole concept and doctrine of sin. In Pasquale's general doctrine, man sinned or prevaricated, to use his terminology, when he sought to create material life without God's agreement for purposes other than building and policing the universe. Adam was influenced by evil to make beings to worship him as a god, but he was not commanded or forced to do so. Sin, therefore, is the fault of man. For the Gnostics, however, human spirits are splinters not of some super angel, but of imprisoned particles of the divinity itself, carried into matter against its will by the demiurge in order for him to create life. This is a significant difference with Gnosticism. Thus, for Pasquale, our present condition is the direct result of sin, and we inherit that sin from Adam. We cannot avoid blame or point to anyone other than ourselves as being responsible. In the Gnostic system, there is no sin, no fall, no fault, no blame placed on man for our present condition. His only duty is to obtain sufficient self-realization to escape a bad world. Yet Pasquale would have man redeemed, not from knowledge, but from works or actions that reach out from him, for the guidance and barrier he needs to be shielded from the influence of the evil thoughts around him. This should also convince us that Pasquale's doctrine was not Gnostic. Thirdly, the Soter, or saviour, of Gnosticism is simply a guide. Yet for Pasquale, the physical incarnation into material matter of the octonary spirit in a dual nature is altogether different, because it was Christ's blood that was needed to purge the form of human impurity, a sacrificial oblation, fully in keeping with Catholic doctrine. Again, this is not at all Gnostic, because an incarnation without the cross was insufficient. The God-man Jesus had to be the final elect minor guide. True, but this makes perfect sense of the New Testament narratives concerning the Jewish concept of the Mashiach, or Messiah, the Anointed One. Yet, it is only through Christ that those sealed by the mark of his blood can retrace a path of ascent through the celestial worlds following earthly death. This is not limited, however, to the pneumatics or spiritual types of Gnosticism, since in Pasquale's system all of humanity is to be restored to the collective soul of Adam eventually. The sealed are simply those who must first purify themselves through the force and power of Christ's blood on their astral forms, and whose mastery over the evil intelligences beset them will seal the bulk of mankind in turn. Well, that concludes my lecture this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are unable to participate in the following discussion, here are some contact points for you: web address, email. There's a group called the Lessons of Leon on Facebook, and I have a Twitter account. As already mentioned, the Lessons of Leon are available for purchase on Amazon and online through Barnes & Noble and Waterstones. So I'll now hand back to my brethren at the Arizona Lodge of Research number 1 to open the Q&As. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate that. That was an amazing presentation, brother. I'd like to go out and start off with the Q&A. One of the first things we have for the Q&A, and let me go and fix this real quick. All right, here we go. So one of the first things we have in the Q&A was a question one of the brothers asked in Arizona. It says, what is La Chose?
Go for the big questions first, Taylor.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the system of the Elohim was theurgical, so it was invocatory. Now, La Chose, Legend Inconnue, unknown philosopher, however you want to refer to it, appears to have been some sort of ectoplasmic entity that they managed to invoke. We know this from Pasquale's letters. In fact, at the beginning of the Lessons of Leon, I quote Pasquale for his description of his experience of La Chose very briefly. This is from one of his letters in the book. He says, the visions are white, blue, pink. In short, they are mixed, or all white, the colour of the flame of a white wax candle. You'll see the sparks. You'll feel the flesh creep all over your body. All that announces the beginning of the traction which La Chose makes with the one who works. They're interesting words, an interesting description. But essentially, it comes down to this. In Pasquale's system, man requires the guidance of lofty, high spiritual beings. Now, man also needs the guidance and help of the prophets that came before. There were 10 of them. You can't achieve reintegration simply with one, you need both. Christ, of course, incorporates both in his incarnation. He came as the 10th prophet, and he is the supernal spiritual being. Now, it's likely that Pasquale regarded La Chose as the presence of Christ. Now, A.E. Waite is quite interesting on this, and I'll quote you from it, because A.E. Waite has this to say. Now, I'm quoting here from, if you've got it, great. If you haven't, buy it. Where are we? It's you can't really see it very clearly, but it's The Secret Tradition in Freemasonry. And he says this: the quality of Pasquale's theurgic ceremonial differed essentially by its motive, though not unfortunately in its procedure, from the common and familial intentions and concerns of practical magic. It was not the evocation of demons as such, of demons under the guise of angels, of familiar spirits, or of any foul traffic represented by the ceremonial literature of the past. The hope, the attempt, and the supposed result were to establish intercourse with Christ under the name of the repairer, and the thesis was that the master came in person and instructed his disciples. Now, it's certainly true that Pasquale did say that he had connected or manifested La Chose. And possibly, is that the repairer? Is that the raised Christ, the spirit of the person? Waite goes on to say, I do not propose to debate the question whether such a manifestation was impossible, or what actually appeared under the form of the unknown agent, Legend Inconnu, as it was also termed. I set aside further the question of collective hallucination. We have insufficient material, so there should be no need to say for the determination of the latter point. But he says this: I desire only to put on record my personal assurance, after an anxious review of all the facts available, A, that manifestations of a very marked kind did take place, B, that they were characterized by high distinctive motives, and also the results in teaching that was going on. So Waite suggests that this lofty being, La Chose, certainly did manifest to Pasquale. I would say that given that the integration of the major spirit with the elect minor, the prophet, the final prophet coming as a guide, the culmination of that would mean that La Chose probably was referring to the presence of Christ being manifested. Now, someone would beg to differ, but none of us were there in the 18th century to participate. So there we have it. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. And another question off of that and stuff from another brother. They're saying that to Pascal, is La Chose a spirit? Does it have a consciousness of its own?
Well, yes, would be the answer, wouldn't it? If it is the person of Christ, it would. Now, if you believe in spirits and angels and archangels and even God, then you'll know spirit does have a persona, a mind, a consciousness. I mean, it could just have been ectoplasm that he manifested. Who knows? It could have been mass hallucination, as Waite was saying, as a possibility.
Mhm.
But I wasn't there, and I don't think anybody else is old enough to be there either.
Perfect. We have another question from another brother, Mark Richardson. He says Pascal, as the operator, punished the purgated spirits in the operation circle, yet he also has us tasked with healing them and bringing them back to God. Is this contradictory?
No, because God loves everything. And the idea really is to fully reintegrate even the fallen spirits, even Lucifer, to reintegrate him with God and to bring them back. Adam's task wasn't simply to punish or imprison, but it was actually to love and to draw back these fallen entities. So that's quite correct what the brother has just said, but it's not contradictory. In fact, it's the opposite, isn't it? It's actually completely consistent, I would have thought.
Perfect. And another question that we have is, what is your opinion on modern day practice of Elocohen and its reimplementation into newer Martinist orders?
Okay, well, Pappas essentially re-establishes Martinism in around about 1891. So I wouldn't argue that there was a succession from Pasquale to that time. I know people come up with this idea that in Russia it somehow survived, but the problem, of course, is that the winds of revolution and change and things of that nature simply come along. And I think it's wishful thinking that there's a continuity. Pasquale's son became a police officer, for instance, in revolutionary France. So he was intended to be the Grand Master and successor to his father. And that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So the French Revolution got in the way. Pappas, of course, himself died in 1916. If there was a Martinist order in Russia, it would have been wiped out by the Russian Revolution as well. You're really looking at the 1940s onwards, aren't you, with Robert Anne Boleyn and so forth, for the reinstitution of the Elocohen. But that said, if they were to sort of follow those rites of exactitude, and if they had Pasquale's deep Christian sort of provenance behind all of that, if they were able to rise above ordinary life in the way that he wanted people to do, true chivalry in that sense, then there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to sort of reinstitute. But as to whether it's a succession and connection, I would argue not.
Perfect. One of the other questions that we have is, and it's a newer one, does one of the colors of the rainbow represent the day God rested?
It has to, doesn't it, if you think about it? I don't know which color it is, though. There's 7. You'll notice actually on the menorah, the picture of the menorah I put up, it was orange, wasn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Perfect. Another question that we have is, would Freemasonry be what it is today if the Templars did not exist? I want to also add to that Will or Moses' influence in Masonry and Templarism.
Well, yes, I understand that. I think you have to go back further than that, though. I think you're looking at Ramsey, really, aren't you, for the origins of Templarism in Freemasonry. The Chevalier Ramsey. Nobody knows for sure, and I certainly don't, but I would have thought that the returning Crusader Masons joined operative guilds back in Europe, in Scotland or wherever, and brought with them some of their views and beliefs and practices. I don't see an issue with that. Chevalier Ramsay, of course, came over, did he not, with the Jacobites over into France. So it's possible that there's a Templar provenance somewhere. I don't think it's direct, though. I think the origins of Freemasonry are in the medieval Masonic guilds. I think specifically Freemasonry, as we know it now, speculative Freemasonry, came about through the Rosicrucian infiltration of the operative guilds in the 16th century and the 17th century. By the time you get to Elias Ashmole in the mid-17th century, there's records of him attending the Accepted, for instance, in London and things of that nature. And that all came about because the medieval guilds were in decline as a result of the Reformation. Their work dried up and also became less spiritual, obviously. But the obvious choice for the Rosicrucians would have been Masonry because of the architectural knowledge and Pythagorean principles that they were taught. So they'd have made a beeline for them. So it infiltrated French Masonry via Ramsay, and essentially then filtered down to the likes of Villemuse. There can be no doubt, though, that the Yellow Cohen or Villemuse's subsequent orders that he established in France are chivalric, and obviously the idea of chivalry was a medieval principle, wasn't it? And it sort of was either resurrected in the early 18th century by the likes of Ramsay, or else it had always been present in Freemasonry and followed its way through. But other than that, I actually can't answer the question directly because I simply don't know if there is a connection. If Masonry owes a debt to Templarism, I don't know. But if you're talking about the Templar Order, the KTs, then you're really essentially going back at most to the 1780s with Duga. But hopefully, before then, who knows?
Perfect. Thank you for answering Brother Andrew Long's question from Arizona. It's much appreciated. Now we're going to go on to Richard Johnson. He says, is Martinism Rosicrucianism? They seem to be different, defined, but many seem to indicate that Martinism has the same theurgical and esoterical elements. How is Martinism more mystical?
Well, Rosicrucianism is a broad church. You have anthroposophists who are Rosicrucians, and not only Freemasons, for instance. So it's not the only, we don't represent the only tradition in Rosicrucianism. I think that, broadly speaking, I would say yes, Martinism is Rosicrucian. I don't think there can be any doubt about it. But it does also incorporate other ideas such as alchemy and the Kabbalah, for instance. So it's not a purely Rosicrucian order. What was the rest of the question? Sorry.
How is Martinism more mystical?
How is it more mystical than Rosicrucianism? Well, I couldn't answer that. I think if you have a heptad that's pretty mystical, then you're going to enjoy that and benefit from it. But Rosicrucianism is a concept. It's an entirely different thing in that regard.
All right, and CBCS of Freemasonry is quite elusive. Very few Templar Masons, if recognized at all anymore. However, can you get those same grades and lessons within Martinism?
Yeah, I'll have to pass on that one.
All right, no problem. All right, the next question we have is, are correspondences possible between the first degree tracing board, Tree of Life, the universal table? Are they just different interpretations of the same esoteric principle?
Yeah, I tend to think that's true. You eventually get to a point, don't you, where you if you follow a sort of circular pattern in studies and esoteric learning where everything almost becomes as one in many ways. So yeah, I do tend to agree with that as a sort of general observation. Yeah.
Perfect. Another question that we have is, how do dimensions of the arc correspond to creation? That's a
Well,
bit of a
the lessons of Leon discuss that in detail. Essentially comes down to its dimensions and geometry. For instance, there are three compartments, which I think it's Villemuse that discusses that in more detail, alludes to the major, inferior, minor spirits, for instance. So yes, there's a lot of correspondence, and it's all contained in there. It's probably best to have a read of that, I think. It's a subject of an entirely different lecture. I'd love to do it though. Do some work and research on that.
perfect. I appreciate that. Another question that we have is, what is the state or condition or strength of the line of study today for Martinism? Would you say the strength or state or current condition is?
I can't really comment on that again because there are so many different branches, and I would have thought that it's suffering with the sort of general decline of religious awareness, I suppose, in society. I don't know how the numbers are. My heptad's pretty small. It hasn't met for some time, so if that's any indication, I don't know.
What do you think can make it stronger, by chance?
Well, I think the internet can play a large role in that. So conversations and discussions such as ours, where we share our researches and learn from each other, would be a good recruiting ground for that kind of thing. But I think it's a case of we don't necessarily want quantity. I think we need to have and focus on, as Pasquale did,
Mm-hmm.
focus on candidates of quality, of understanding, of peace and patience, who will then inevitably attract others to join them, to follow. But I think that this medium now, the internet, the fact that, look, we're talking, I'm in England, you're in Arizona, we're talking live
Yep.
with this technology. So, people will listen to this stuff and hopefully ask more questions. How do I get in touch? What do I need to do?
Mm-hmm.
Etc.
Another question that we have is by Mark Richardson. Most modern Martinist orders have seemed to turn their backs on the original source materials of Pascali's system. What do you think this happened?
Well, I agree with him. I think, again, it's to do essentially with the way society has been going. A decline in perhaps organized religions, which has then had a sort of knock-on effect in terms of the people that may be drawn to Martinism specifically as a sort of esoteric wing of that, if you see what I mean. Which is the way the mystical tradition has always operated. It has needed the exoteric and drawn from it, and vice versa. So there's an imbalance at the moment in society and spiritually, and we see it manifested in so many ways. But the decline, yes, I think it's to do with that, and I think also perhaps with the disappearance of the order with Pasquale's death, and similar orders around the time of the great upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries. The orders stopped, they died out, they were resurrected, they stopped again and began properly in the sort of 1940s onwards. So I think that lack of continuity or succession has a lot to do with it as well. So we need to build from the bottom up and just attract quality candidates, I suppose.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's definitely great seeing more Martinist orders pop out recently and stuff, and research being shared everywhere around Martinism. It's absolutely very beautiful how you can see communities of Martinist brothers starting to grow and connect, and it's absolutely beautiful that it's the orders expanding on the internet wise and stuff. It's very great for the community and stuff, and very great to individuals' personal growth and for them achieving their personal reintegrations. Just say. Another question that we have, and this is the last question that we have, is what is one of your favorite pieces of knowledge that has been mentioned in your book? Translation.
I think that was your question, wasn't it, Taylor?
Yes, it was.
Well, let's turn it back on you. I know what mine is. Mine is just the cosmogony of Martinez de Pasquale and his explanation of the fall and everything else. And because, I mean, for me, the biblical metaphors work because I'm from that background and tradition. So it's something I can identify with and work with. For someone outside it, I don't know. But it explains to me why the world is as it is and what we should be doing about it and about ourselves to improve and move on. But what I mean, you've read the lessons of Leon now, and you invited me to come on here. So, I mean, what is it? What do you get from it? What's been the biggest benefit to you?
There's a bunch. Actually, it's a very beautiful piece. It's a very beautiful work for the doctrine of reintegration, and the concepts that you could take and learn to understand definitely give you a broader outlook on your own personal reintegration. It gives you a broader outlook on how the universe is even assembled, or just even delving down to the core processes of its metaphysics to the deepest root, or even the concept of infinity, universal table, the study of Lachos and stuff. It's just, I mean, it's infinite within itself. It's absolutely amazing how much you can learn and come to understand with all core principles of Lachos itself and the teachings of everything it shows. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's also something that you come back to after you've been away studying something else and learning other things, and you come back and you read it then with even greater clarity.
Without a doubt. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So did you want to go ahead and talk about your new book since we just finished up with questions?
Well, very quickly then, I'll just mention, because I think I wrote to you guys concerning allegory and stone. Now, I think one of the questions earlier was the Templar point, really, I think. Going back a stage further, was Freemasonry, as in speculative, Freemasonry, was it a result of the infiltration of Rosicrucians into the Masonic guilds or not? And I wanted to explore this because what triggered it was a visit to Stratford upon Avon and a visit to William Shakespeare's parish church, and noticing from his funerary monument what appeared to me both Masonic and Rosicrucian symbolism at a point in time when they're telling us that neither was far enough advanced to actually feature in a Jacobean grave of that time, 1616. But there they are. They're there. There are 7 red roses in the arch above him with our two columns. And I wanted to also, because we're all on this journey, it's why we like this stuff. We like a riddle. We like to translate and interpret things, don't we? And there are two poems as well on it as well. And the deeper you dig into it, the more you realise that actually it's a description of the master and his wardens in the lodge. And amongst other things, there's also a utopian theme in there as well, which is highly Rosicrucian. And there are then also the other imagery contained in this monument. So I wrote the book really to essentially discuss, here it is here, discuss, I need to take that blur off the background, don't I?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, okay, let's get rid of that. Oh, there we are. Okay, so here it is. Okay. So the book essentially takes apart piece by piece Shakespeare's funerary monument and argues that there is a Masonic connection with this. So, by way of example, there's a look at the poem in English. There's a look at the Latin inscription, but also with regard to the actual structure or architecture. You have here, of course, two putti. And interestingly enough, by way of example, and I point out in my book, these two chaps are carrying a skull and also an inverted torch. So very Masonic symbols. And the same is also true of Shakespeare's coat of arms. So the lance essentially is a trowel and the colours are alchemical. So there's a very strange connection. And what I wanted to do also was to draw in themes of the structure of, for instance, the Kabbalah. You can see there's a clearly Kabbalistic structure to the monument. So there are all these things, and it's very interesting. And I wanted to get back to the origins of Freemasonry, really, or at least a theory of it, and how early it was, and whether or not Shakespeare could possibly have been a Freemason. He was certainly a Rosicrucian, in my opinion. People differ on these ideas. But if you look at the monument in detail, this is the way to go. And if you're ever in England and you do go to the monument, you want a copy of this book with you when you go to look at it, because it does break it down piece by piece and also provides an interpretation, translation of the Latin poem, for instance. Okay, so that's another talk. And I did one actually on Sapere Aude as well, which is on YouTube at the moment. But I'd like to revisit this because this is actually my favourite book. And it's short too. It's about 100 pages, so it's not a long read. But it does require some background knowledge of a little bit on Rosicrucianism and also Freemasonry to get the most out of it. And there you have it. That's what I was about. But you wanted me to talk about the lessons of Lyons, didn't you, Taylor?
Yes, thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you very much, Brother Osborne, for the great presentation and conversation. And we look forward to your next visit with Arizona Research Lodge number 1.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right. Everybody else, thank you as well. This is Worshipful Brother Taylor Larson at Phoenix for Arizona Research Lodge number 1. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. See you next time.
Thank you.